This presentation on forage testing is part of the Spring 2021 Beef Cattle Production Series organized by Fort Valley State University, Dr. Niki Whitley and Stefan Price with Mr. Kennedy, AgriUnity, LLC.
I think once a week I'm giving a presentation similar to this. So we were working on an improved extension bulletin to help answer a lot of the questions that we're going to find here in this presentation. Because when we get into the heart of winter feeding here, this information is pretty critical for a lot of our producers. So I want to start, and I don't want it to be a vocabulary lesson by any means. So just to introduce you to some of these words that you may or may not have seen before on different forage reports or in nutrition bulletins and things like that, just to make sure that we're all on the same playing field here. First, we're going to start with moisture and dry matter. We tend to use dry matter basis for comparing our samples. So if we're comparing samples from two different cuttings or two different farms, but we're going to use the as-fed basis for actually determining a feed ration. And so that's not something that I usually do in my role. It'd be something you'd work with someone like Walton Stewart, our beef nutritionist on. But those, we'll see both dry matter and as-fed on a lot of forage reports, and they mean very different things. The reason for that is fresh forage is usually about 80% moisture, 85% moisture. Whereas if we take it down to dry hay, it's 80 to 85% dry matter. If we were doing baleage, it's somewhere there in the middle. And so we want to make sure that when we're looking at that forage report, we understand what those different columns on that report mean. And I have an example to show in the next section here. You may also see different fiber components. Two of the most common that we're going to see on there are neutral detergent fiber and acid detergent fiber. A neutral detergent fiber is roughly estimated to be the total fiber in the forage, whereas the acid detergent fiber is the least digestible fiber in that forage. So ideally, we want these to be, as low as possible. As our NDF is going up, intake tends to go down. Likewise with ADF, as ADF goes up, our energy is coming down. So a lot of the producers that I've worked with tend to get fixated on crude protein. And protein is important. It's just usually not our most limiting nutrient. I run into many more cases where energy is much more limiting than protein ever is. What's also important is that when we talk about crude protein, it doesn't represent good usable protein. It's just how much of the nitrogen is in that forage sample. And it's just a simple calculation of nitrogen content times 6.25, and that's the number that we see on a lot of our reports. We don't always know what form that nitrogen is in. And so crude protein, it estimates all the nitrogen, so it's not separating out those nitrates that can be toxic to a lot of our livestock. And so the high nitrate concentrations can artificially increase our crude protein levels so that we think we're feeding something good when in all actuality, it's actually pretty toxic to our cattle. There's a lot of different ways that we can look at digestibility. Probably the most common one you'll see is in vitro dry matter digestibility. The word true may be tucked in there. It's usually abbreviated since it is such a long name. But this is representing how much forage would be digested in a set amount of time. The one that's probably most common on our forage reports is 48 hours, but you can see them from 12 up to 72 hours, especially if you're looking at some of the dairy reports. We can either directly measure this or estimate it in our NIR, which is most common for a lot of our beef producers. A term you are probably most familiar with out of all of these is TDN, or total digestible nutrients. It measures the energy value of a forage. It's important to remember, though, that this is just a calculation. It's not something that we're directly measuring. We're measuring or estimating other things that go into this calculation. And it is good. The way we calculate it depends on if it's a grass or a legume. And there's a lot of different calculations out there. We've even had an entire session at our national forage meeting this past January on the best way to calculate these parameters such as TDN. But most of our labs, as far as I know, as long as they're the accredited laboratories, they're using an approved equation. Many of these, whether they should be or not, are still based as ADF. So as ADF goes up, our TDN is going down. So as we work in the future, we're going to bring more digestibility measures into these calculations so that we don't focus solely on ADF. Another one that you'll see on the report is dry matter intake. So this is predicting the amount of dry matter that's consumed by the animal. The calculation, again, it depends on the forage group. These calculations are a little more straightforward. Many tend to be NDF based, and so as NDF goes up, our dry matter intake is coming down. The last one on here is relative forage quality. So RFQ is an index that's allowing us to rank different forages. So we don't use RFQ to make any feed ration decisions or in those calculations, but it does allow us to compare many different forages on an apples to apples basis rather than apples to oranges. So it puts everything on the same scale so that we could line them up as hay ranked 1 to 4. So this is actually what we use for the Southeast Hay Contest, where we have so many different forages coming in. The calculations that go into this are the TDN and dry matter intake. They're representing the energy that's available. So it's taking all of these different numbers that we just talked about and putting them into one energy value. Depending on the lab that you send your samples to, you may still run across a report that uses RFV. It's relative feed value. That's not one that we recommend for use in forages because it doesn't account for how digestible a forage is and can really undersell a lot of our high quality forage products. So you'll still see it, especially in corn silage type situations, but we're really promoting the use of RFQ. So our next step is then how to read that forage test. Most producers that I'm working with are going to send a sample to the UGA Feed Environmental Water Lab in Athens, and we're using option F2 because it's giving us all the values that we talked about plus nitrates. And even though this, this is just one report, there are many different labs out there that may have a slightly different layout to their report, and so they should all have the same words on there. They may just be in a different order, and it takes a minute to orient yourself to navigate the report. Ours are pretty much divided into 3 sections. We're going to zoom in on here so you don't have to try to read the tiny one. All of our producer and counting information is at the top, as well as the test that was requested. So that's all stuff that's written down on the submission form. Then we get into the crop use and the class of livestock, and that can affect some of the results. So it's important that those be as accurate as possible. So also up in the top part of the report, and logically it would make sense to me to put the RFQ at the bottom of the report since we're working down into that. But our lab actually puts them tucked up here at the top. So they'll list out the relative forage quality and then the dry matter intake. When we move down into the body of the report, it can get confusing quickly if we're not careful. There's a lot of different numbers going on, and not all of them are ones that we need as beef producers on a daily basis. You'll see the 2 columns within each side here. So this dry matter is the one that we want to look at because that's how all of our extension recommendations are made. As sampled is how we're going to actually feed that. So you'll see that the numbers go down because it's discounting the water that's in here. So our protein and fiber components that we talked about earlier are here in the first column. And then the TDN and the moisture are there in the second column. You may be thinking, why are we so interested in that moisture number? If someone sends me a report and says my cows aren't eating this or it smells funny, moisture is one of the first things I'll look at, because if it creeps over 18, 20%, it's a pretty good sign there's probably some mold in there somewhere, and it gives us an idea of where to start looking for potential problems. So down in the bottom of the report, the most common thing that we'll see on here is nitrates. You can have aflatoxins and other things down here if you request them. But the reason we like the F2 is because it puts nitrates on there for us. It seems like such a big number that is still considered safe, but remember, this is parts per million, so it's quite small. So we consider anything under 4,500 parts per million to be completely safe to feed, as long as the animals have adequate feed and water. As we start increasing that nitrate level, you'll see that we start limiting how much we put in the ration. Anything above 18,000, we don't recommend feeding in most cases, because it's very risky and we have to be careful in diluting it. And a lot of us, as a beef producer, you can't limit how much is out there, much below a third to a quarter. Now, if we were in a dairy situation where we were mixing a TMR and feeding animals in a bunk, that would be a different story. But it's hard when our main feed source is round bales to be able to limit that forage. Those nitrates are coming from excessive nitrogen. It can come through fertilization, if it's moisture stress, or if we had growth limiting factors. So often in times of cold or drought stress, things that are limiting that plant's growth. And as soon as it's coming out of there, the nitrates tend to be very high in concentration. So in a lot of cases, it's just a way to mitigate that is waiting before we go out and graze or harvest for that nitrate concentration to come back down. There's a lot of other commercial labs out there. Their tests should all have the same components. And I know this one's really blurry. It's from Cumberland Valley. They're just going to have a different layout. So this one had a lot of the same information, actually had a lot more, because it was formulated for dairy cattle here in Tifton. I understand maybe not everybody's using the UGA lab, but these words should be the same if you're sending a sample to any accredited laboratory. So let's take it a step further and look at how we actually are using a forage test. So when we start thinking about how we're going to feed our beef cows or any livestock for that matter, we want to first get an understanding for what the production system looks like, understand what the forage system looks like, and then look at developing an economic supplementation plan if needed. So when we look at the production system, reproductive efficiency is the most important factor that affects profitability. And so the first question that we're always going to ask is, what are your goals of the operation? And while we keep that in mind, we also have to remember that the animal's priorities never align with the producer's priorities. The producer, when we say, what is your goal? They want to put a calf on the ground every year. They want that cow to lactate as much as possible. They want that calf to grow. And then at the end of all that, well, whatever she needs for maintenance, she can have that. The animal, on the other hand, thinks a little differently. The animal's number one goal is just to survive at that maintenance level. Beyond that, then it's going to start thinking about growth and lactation. And then after all of those needs are met, if applicable, then it's thinking about reproduction. So very often our goal as a producer is not going to align with that animal's goal. And so we've got to compensate for that when we're developing our feeding plans. The next part is to understand that forage program. Some questions that we'll likely ask, especially this time of year, is how many bales are still available? How much do they weigh? So we can get an idea for how much forage or how much tonnage is available in that stored feed. Do we know what the quality is? And if not, can we get that measured? And then how long do they need to last? Because that's going to help kind of guide us through that supplementation strategy. So we want to know kind of what's available in your area before we start picking supplements. A lot of producers are going to look at a commercial feed or byproduct. I know lick tanks are very popular, especially down here in South Georgia. When there's like I said, there's a lot of products out there, and so we want to evaluate them on the dry matter basis, especially when we start looking at those tanks, tubs, or blocks. If there's any liquid in there and the molasses, so that we're looking at the dollars of the actual nutrient that's available, not necessarily the dollar for that unit of product, because it could be more diluted in some products that compared to others. Another part of the decision may be how can we, or are we capable of handling and storing the product? And then what are the mineral needs? So I know a lot of producers are calling about high mag mineral right now. So that could play into this. The other part of that is how much do I need? And that's really where we get into the extension answer of it depends. To give you a good idea of what the nutrient demands would be for a 1,000-pound beef cow, because that's where a lot of our recommendations are set at. You can see that as she moved, there's my cursor, as we're moving from a dry cow into late gestation and entering lactation, her demands for dry matter intake are steadily increasing. Same way with crude protein, drop back off there in late lactation. And again, with TDN, which is usually our most limiting nutrient here, this would be the minimum they require. So we go from 48 up to 60 and then start to taper back down once they enter late lactation. So a lot of the calls that are coming in right now with problems, with losing animals or animals losing condition is related to not feeding enough energy and sometimes protein. But there's been a lot of forage reports coming in that would barely meet the needs of a dry cow, and they're being fed to cattle in peak and late lactation. So this is where having that forage report can really save a lot of time and money, so that we make sure that we're feeding the right hay to the right animal and enough of the hay, or supplementing if it can't meet her needs. So let's get a little interactive, and this works so much better if we're actually in person and you can see and feel all the hay samples. But we did take a picture of all of these last summer because I got tired. I had a trailer full of hay and I was tired of hauling it around. So we took pictures of them. If you've already seen the video, you're a step ahead here. So we made a video and Facebook post on these three hays. I think we've got the chat featured and enabled here. So if you all could type in there, which of these three hays do you think is the best hay, just looking at the picture? We'll call this one hay number 1. This is hay number 2, and this is hay number 3. We got a couple votes here. There's a strong pulling for hay number 2. I guess I should look to see how many people are actually logged at 35. All right. All right, so we got a pretty good pull there for hay number 2, a couple hay number 1s. So this goes to show, and whether I ask this question through video conference here and you see it on the screen or in person, everybody loves hay number 2. And this is a really good example of why we need that forage test. Oh, it's not gonna let me show. There we go. So let me walk you through these three hays. Hay number 1 is actually a Tifton 85 Bermuda grass hay sample. Was cut right on time at 4 weeks. It's irrigated if it needs to be. It's fertilized correctly. Everything was done right to that hay. Where it is a Tifton 85 sample, though, the leaves are a little big, the stems are bigger. It doesn't have that same kind of pretty aesthetic of the fine stem Bermuda that a lot of us are used to. And so nobody ever really likes hay number 1. even though nutritionally it's the best sample here. Hay number 2 that everybody really, everybody just raved about this hay at our hay and bayless short courses. It's a Tifton 44 sample, which is why it's so pretty and still has a little bit of its green color there. Super soft leaves and fine stem. That hay was actually cut at the end of a drought. So it's about 6 to 7 weeks old. Wasn't fertilized because budgets were cut. It looks nice, but there's not a lot of quality there and would require supplementation in many cases of lactating animals where we're at right now. That hay number 3, thankfully nobody ever likes hay number 3. It was an old mixed Bermuda grass stand. They actually just cut the hay because they needed extra parking for the bull test is the only reason I think that one got cut. And if you could smell it, you didn't smell it for very long. You took a step back. It was some pretty rank Bermuda grass. Unfortunately, that represents a lot of hay that's being fed right now. And we're going to get into why that can be problematic. So if we assume we have a 1,200 pound beef cow, so 1,000 pounds probably more likely for a lot of us. So numbers would be just a little lower for a 1,000 pound cow. But if she's there in early lactation, she's going to require about 18 pounds of energy and about 3 pounds of protein every single day. And so what we did with these 3 piles of hay is we stacked them up so that we could see, pounds wise what that would start to look like for the most limiting nutrients. We're going to start first here with energy. It takes 29 pounds of that first hay to meet her energy needs. 35 pounds in the middle hay and 41 pounds of that hay number 3 that I said was pretty rank. And so this really shows the whole quality versus quantity because yes, the one here on the end, that hay number 3, produced a lot of tonnage, but it didn't give us a lot of nutrient density in that hay. And so we actually can feed a lot less of hay number 1 because it has more energy per pound of forage. Likewise with protein, we needed 19 pounds of hay number 1, 31 pounds of hay number 2, and 43 pounds of hay number 3. Go ahead and flip it over. This we just spun the camera around so we could see it from a different angle. You wouldn't think 29 versus 43 doesn't sound like that big of a difference, but in terms of just sheer volume of hay, you can see how much bigger that stack number 3 was compared to that stack number 1 down there on the end. And so if these stacks represented what was the most limiting nutrient and how many pounds of hay it would take to meet that. So, as usual, energy is more limiting than protein. And so protein was actually the most limiting here in that third sample. But you're talking, 29 versus 43. So an extra 14 pounds of hay that we had to feed that one animal every day at that stage that she was at just to meet her needs. And that can quickly add up. So that's what, if that 1,200 pound beef cow can only eat about 30 pounds of dry matter every day, we're going to assume that the hays are 85% dry matter. That means she can eat 35 pounds of hay every day. So the problem we then get into, hay number 1 is exceeding the nutrient requirements. It will be perfectly fine meeting her needs, and we don't have to require supplementation. Hay number 2 should exactly meet the requirements. It was pretty spot on close. So as long as quality is maintained in storage, we don't need to supplement. Likely we'll lose a little bit and need to supply some sort of molasses or energy supplement. The third one there, the cow could, if the only thing that cow had to eat was that hay number 3, she cannot physically hold enough of that hay to meet her daily needs. And so without supplementation, then we get into issues of impaction in the rumen. And you've probably heard some of like our extension veterinarians and stuff talk about cows dying with a full belly. And that's what it goes back to when they're trying to eat and eat and eat enough of that poor quality hay to fill some sort of limiting nutrient, whether it's energy or protein there. And they just physically can't hold enough. So this really shows the power, of a forage test. And if you're interested in the full report, that's what they were. And how it can help kind of make or break some feeding decisions for us. But so we're working on a new publication to get it out. So that really kind of shows the utility of a lot of these numbers. We didn't go through each one of these in the particular example. Hay number 1 here, you can see it's got the lowest fiber, the highest protein. It's the most digestible, lowest lignin, highest TDN, dry matter intake, and RFQ, and they just step down from there. So the reason, or probably the number 1 reason that hay number 1 was so much better was because of the variety and that it was cut on time. Ultimately, forage quality and quantity are going to depend on a lot of interacting factors, which is definitely a topic for another time. But we tend to with a lot of the forage management, we get focused on the quantity and forget about the quality. And how, maybe making a few fewer bales can really still pay off in the long run because we're getting a more nutrient dense product to store in the barn over the winter. If you do have any questions or want to see some of our extension bulletins and such, we have them on our Georgia Forages website. But we do have our Georgia Forages YouTube channel up and running, so videos on forage management and making economic forage decisions. If you have any recommendations for new videos, I will gladly take those because I am running out of options. And with that, I can take any questions.
Dr. Baxter.
Mm-hmm.
I put mine in chat, but I wanted to know what's the cost of the F2 hay test versus the F3?
All right, so the F2 is $20 and the F3 is $15. It looks like the difference between those is the nitrates.
So for a beef cattle producer, cow-calf operator, which one would you recommend?
That extra $5 for that nitrates, it's a pretty good deal. The nitrates alone is more than $5. So that's a little bit of insurance that can go a long way.
Okie doke.
So the reason we tend to recommend that F2 is because inevitably this time of year somebody calls and says, my cows are dying, what's wrong? And the start questions are, did you take a forage test and have you tested for nitrates?
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Baxter, thank you so much. My question is, maybe I missed it. When is the best time to take the forage test?
So in my mind, there's never a bad time to take a forage test if I can get somebody to take one. Ideally, we want to take it close to feeding. It's nice to have them right out of the field, so then we know where to put the sample. So where to put the hay. So is this hay barn worthy, or do we need to store it outside? But if we don't want to take if you just have money for one sample, I would take it about a month before feeding.
Okay. And if you had more money, and would you consider doing it twice? Like if you stored it, take it before storage and then after storage, or is that?
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to have them right after you cut. So then going into winter, you know what forages you're working with. Mm-hmm. And then if you could sample again before feeding, so you know kind of real time, do I need to supplement? Is this still the same hay that came, out of the field? Usually with barn storage, we lose very little in terms of dry matter and quality, unless we get into a situation where the barn was packed incorrectly or packed too full and we didn't have good airflow through there and we get some mold. In most cases, we consider it if we're not dealing with a mold issue, it should be stable and be equal to what was brought in out of the field. If we're storing outside, even storing correctly outside, we can still stand to lose up to about 10%. More in some cases, well, this year where it won't stop raining. And so it's something to consider to take multiple tests.
Then should you, if you're going to purchase your hay, should you ask for a forage test before you purchase?
Ideally, in a perfect world, we would sell hay in terms of quality or in tons of nutrient rather than in tons of hay. But I think I'm going to work my entire career to get to that point. I don't think it's unreasonable to say, before I hand you the check, I would like to send a test off, just even if the buyer's paying for it, just because I've had 2 emails already that a producer has bought hay and it turned out that it was not very good hay and they're stuck with it now. So not only did they pay for hay, now they had to pay for a vet to check their livestock and for a feed bill to supplement the bad hay.
Dr. Baxter, could you tell the group, or if you have a picture to show them, what would be the correct way to sample that rolled bale or a square bale?
So many of the producers, from my experience, are going to rely on their county extension agent to help pull the samples, just because of the cost of some of the forage testing equipment. So the forage probe that we use, ignore my little Lego here, we use it on a cordless drill so we can be more flexible. If you're sampling a lot of different hay, you consider getting a corded drill hooked up to a generator of some sort in the truck. The forage cores are going to have a kind of tube-like probe on here that cuts into the bale. This is the Star Quality sampler. If you go to our YouTube page, we do have an entire video on the different forage samplers. As we're buying these 4 agents, we're really looking to replace a lot of them with this Star Quality sampler, just because it's so quick and easy, and it works great for baleage. And so as more producers are doing baleage, getting them with a core that county set up with a core that can support that. So what we do when we go out to take the sample, just like soil sampling that we talked about 2 weeks ago, we're going to sample from as many bales as possible. In an ideal world, we'd pull a core from every bale. That's not always possible. We want to sample, at least 10 to 15% of the bales for every lot of hay. We define a lot of hay as hay that came out of the same field, that was managed the same way, and also harvested and put up the same way. So if we fertilize differently, we're going to split it into two lots. If we got half the field baled and the other half got rained on, we need to send in 2 samples, and so on and so forth. We always want to put the probe cutting into the bale on the round side, because that samples from more locations within a windrow or in multiple windrows that were out in the hayfield. Whereas if you just reached into the side or the flat side of the bale and pulled it out, that's one location rather than 15 to 20 locations in that single bale. Same thing with if we're doing square bales, you're going to go into the smaller square side, so between the twine wrapping the bale. So you're going across those multiple flakes in that bale rather than just reaching in the side and pulling it out. To give you an idea for the cost here, these are about $300, I think, plus shipping from Canada. They do their job. They're pricey, though. They are very pricey. Most forage cores are in that $200 to $400 range, plus the price of whatever drill. And so that's why we're trying to get these into county offices, because realistically, you may use this 3 or 4 days a year. And so if you're not putting up, a couple hundred bales, even more than that, it's hard to justify that cost for just one producer and one farm in many cases.
Is there an alternative, Dr. Baxter, if you don't have the probe? I mean, is there any other method?
That's the best method that we have. Some people get creative and make their own. What we tend to run into is that they they'll get very heavy and bulky, and the producer won't want to use them because it's such a workout.
Dr. Baxter, could you break one open? Let's say you're rolling it out to cows. Could you take a grab sample?
So we don't recommend the grab sample just because it's not representing a large enough area. So you would have to take a grab sample from 15 pieces of that single bale to get what that one in-out core would do. So I would say even if your county agent doesn't have one, you shouldn't have to go more than a county away to be able to find a forage probe.
Yeah, I have a question, Dr. Baxter. So
Okay.
now that we have determined that our hay is not up to quality, so what are the most efficient way that we can increase that quality level? I know, of course, we're gonna have to get our soil samples, and you also kept mentioning cut on time. Can you go and elaborate when you say cut on time?
Yeah, so if somebody's looking for, and we say the number one way to improve forage quality, it's to cut on time. And what that means for most of us, especially in Bermuda grass country, is to cut every 28 to 35 days and regularly throughout the season. So it's tempting to wait and cut till it's 6-7 weeks old because you get a lot more tonnage. We just don't get any more digestible dry matter after about that 30-day point. So even though the tonnage is going up, we're not getting increased nutrients with that tonnage.
Is there a certain length? Because I know sometimes that's going to depend on the amount of rain, especially a lot of us, we don't have irrigation on our hay field. So is it a certain length that we should be looking at? If we, because I meant, if you get rain regularly within those 30 days, okay, but if you only get 1 or 2 showers, and if it's 6 inches,
Yeah, we don't know as much in the drought conditions just because that's hard to replicate in an experiment. Usually, if it's not growing at all, we're not losing anything in most cases. The grass is just kind of at a steady state, almost like it had entered dormancy. What we may run into, though, if it's not really growing, odds are that insecticide hasn't been put out either. And so it'll tend to have a lot of Bermuda grass stem maggot damage. And in that case, when the rains are going to start coming back in, we're just going to bush hog it to kind of reset it and let it start growing again.
Alfred Greenlee. I've been able to sell a Bermuda hybrid called Cheyenne 2, which is it's advertised as being a high quality hay as far as the TDN and the crude protein. But the biggest thing still, the challenge, as Hannah was saying, our challenge is I'm able to cut 4 times a year, even after fertilizing, because I do fertilize. But the biggest thing is the water, to be able to cut that every 28 to 35 days and have a stand that's tall enough to give you enough hay for your diesel and your time.
Yeah, so Cheyenne 2 is going to be a little different since it is a seeded Bermuda, and it's not going to produce the same tonnage and on the same interval as our hybrids, and all of our recommendations are for our hybrids. So if you do have one like Cheyenne 2, and there's some others out there, those have different expectations with them.
Dr. Baxter, can you briefly comment on comparing the different strands, like alfalfa versus Bermuda versus the Tifton? Just 2 or 3 examples of that.
Yeah, so in general, when we do more promotion with the hay contest, you'll start seeing that information come out. In general, our alfalfa and our legumes like clovers and stuff are going to be the highest quality forages that we can grow and offer. Well, I guess you have our legumes, the winter annuals, so ryegrass and oats and things like that. Then we have our cool season forages like tall fescue. And then we have our warm season forages like Bermuda grass and Bahia grass. That's if you just compared all the averages. The problem with comparing the averages is there's a huge range on each of those. And you could have some really good quality Bermuda grass or tall fescue outproduce in terms of quality a legume like clovers or alfalfa if it hasn't been handled, if it wasn't cut on time and then handled correctly during that baling process.
Yes, Dr. Baxter, this is Addis. Most people in my area sell both cattle and horse hay. Without inspecting the hay, a rule of thumb with horse hay carry more nutrition value than the average cattle hay, or that's just a myth?
Probably more of a myth, just because a lot of horse hay that's sold in Georgia tends to be Alicia Bermuda grass, and that's probably the worst Bermuda grass that we can grow in our state. There are much better options out there, but generally horse quality means it's more aesthetic rather than an actual quality measure. So it's going to be like that Tifton 44, that hay sample 2 that you saw, where it's really thin stemmed, has fine leaves. It just looks like a pretty hay, whereas it may not have the nutrient requirements that the animals necessarily need.
Horses tend to be more sensitive to molds, and so a lot of times people will sell horse hay that's what they mean is it hasn't gotten wet, it's not moldy. So sometimes that may be the big difference, or it hasn't gotten rained on. So I've had hay producers, the same field, the same cutting, one got in the barn, one got rained on, so the rained on's cow hay and the not rained on is horse hay. So, basically forage test, hay test.
This is James Ford, and I wanted to wait to the last to ask this question. But I'm from South Georgia, and they grow they bale a lot of peanut hay. Just give me your opinion on peanut hay.
So the official UGA answer on peanut hay is we only recommend, I don't know if you can see my video or not, we only recommend organic peanut hay because of all of the pesticides that are sprayed on peanuts. Exactly. Are not necessarily labeled for beef cattle consumption, and so that's up to you and what has been sprayed on that peanuts. There's a lot of peanut hay fed in the southern part of the state. Wouldn't be, you can't lie your way out of that. There's a lot of peanut hay in South Georgia right now. What we really got to be cautious of is the pesticides that could be on there. And then potential molds that are on there as well. There's been 3 calls in the last week or so on aflatoxins in peanut hay that got wet. So organic peanut hay can be a great source of nutrients, but we've got to make sure that it was stored correctly and then that we're feeding it out correctly as well.
And that list you gave us with the alfalfa, and it would be up as far as high as alfalfa?
We don't know because we don't collect data on that. We do collect data on perennial peanut hay, and it's up there with alfalfa. There's just not a lot of perennial peanuts grown in Georgia. They're creeping up. They've been in Florida for years and years now. And we're starting to get more perennial peanut producers in the extreme southern part of the state. It just takes so long to get them established that most people aren't willing to wait 2 to 3 seasons for their first really good crop from something.
This is Delmer Stamps. I got a question. Have you noticed a pattern with similar level of management? Which hay cutting normally yield your highest quality? Beginning of the season, mid-season, late season?
So in general, early in the season is our highest quality. It tends to be too that we have a little ryegrass mixed in there, which drives up that quality. But there's just not as much cell wall and fiber content earlier in the season. So that tends to be our better hay cuttings. In most cases, we tend to be a little drier late May, early June on a typical year. So we're able to get that hay harvested in a timely manner. Whereas as we wait later in the season, we start getting into more hurricane and tropical storm scenarios where we're not necessarily cutting at the optimum time. We're cutting at the first driest chance that we have. Like I said, on our YouTube channel, we've got a lot more videos into some of that answers a lot of the questions that we had here on the forage hay cores and things like that.
Dr. Baxter, I do have one other question. If you wanted to start a fresh hay field, what would be give me some procedures on starting a brand new hay field?
So are we sprigging Bermuda grass, or where are you located?
Doherty County.
Okay. So yeah, you are safely in Bermuda grass country over there. In an ideal world, we would be sprigging Tifton 85 Bermuda grass. We just can't. It's hard to beat Tifton 85 in terms of yield and quality. If there's existing Bermuda grass on the area, we're going to need to go in and you'll spray something like Roundup to start killing it out. I ideally plant some sort of summer annual to help shade it out, because as good as herbicides are, Bermuda grass really doesn't like shade, and that's going to really help us kill out the existing stand. Then we would go in the following year and actually sprig the new Bermuda grass. So if we have to do any pH correction, we're going to do that to start that process before sprigging. Once we put out the sprigs, immediately follow with a pre-emergent herbicide. I think diuron's the one that we have listed right now. And then it's a waiting game there for a while. 85 is great as it is, and most of our Bermuda grasses that we would recommend, they can be a little slow at the beginning. They produce great yields later on. They're slow to start. And so, putting out a lot of potash and a little nitrogen that first year, mowing if needed to help just encourage it to run and spread, and then putting out even more potash right there before winter to help it persist through winter and green up well that next year for you.
So that potash is what helped the stand to be strong also?
Yeah, so that potash is what's critical for making those runners run on top of the ground and then spread out and fill in and survive winter. Then for something like 85, and I think most of our newer hybrids that are being released, they rely a lot on the runners even more so than the rhizomes that are underground. Now, they have a lot of rhizomes underground, and that's why they're so hard to kill out once you get them. But they spread more rapidly, especially early on, from those runners on top of the ground. And that's where that potash really helps.
Okay, what about if you don't sprig, if you use seeds? Is it better to bottom plow and then do it, or try and use a drill, a Notill drill to do it?
So we wouldn't recommend the seeded varieties for a hayfield, especially if you were starting new, just because the tonnage just isn't there long term. If you were going to use a seeded variety in a pasture that would maybe be cut for hay occasionally, those we would still recommend drilling in most cases. You can try to broadcast. It has to be planted so shallow it's really easy to get it too deep, even when you broadcast it and roll it. A great tool would be something like a cultipacker seeder, like a brilliant seeder. Those are just few and far between nowadays.
How do you feel about cotton seeds, Dr. Baxter?
So supplementing with cottonseed?
Yeah.
So Lawton Stewart's been doing some work. One of his grad students has down here in Tifton on supplementing bulls with cottonseed, and I think they've seen some pretty positive results out of it. I'm not sure on the final results from that project yet, because they were also testing, did it cause sterility in the bulls, and I haven't seen any of that data.
Dr. Baxter, what do you think about the quality of TIF9 Bahia grass or some of those
So Bahia grass gets beat up on a lot. Nobody likes to talk about Bahia grass. Overall, the quality, especially compared to our hybrid Bermudas, it's going to be lower. Bahia grass just was not bred to have the same quality standards as a lot of these other improved forages. That said, fertilizing, cutting every 30 days or so, putting out that lime to keep the pH up, things like that are going to help overall the quality improve. It hits an upper threshold to where much over an RFQ of probably 95 or so, we don't really see it exceed that.
I have a follow-up question on that. The behavior, would you recommend that? Would you favor it a little bit more for just grazing?
Yeah, so there have been producers in the last year that I know of, especially down like the Colquitt County area, have put in irrigated Bermuda or Bahia grass hayfields, just because they are sick and tired of spraying for the stem maggot, or they're using Bahia grass in some sort of row crop rotation. Now, in terms of a pasture, Bahia grass is a fantastic option, especially because a lot of areas that we're grazing in the southern part of the state are very acidic. They tend to be waterlogged or flood prone, and Bermuda grass just isn't going to persist in that environment. And so Bahia grass is certainly better than just a field of weeds. It's going to keep that soil intact. It's going to provide that more consistent forage, and give us a lot of benefits. So, without a doubt, in a grazing situation in the southern part of the state, Bahia grass is our only option in a lot of cases. Yeah, so we have, there hasn't been a Bahia grass study done in the state in a long time. And so we actually have 6 varieties of Bahia grass growing in Alapaha right now at the beef research station down there, to look at the differences in yield and quality. So we've got a year of data in now. So after we get another year, we'll start publishing those results.
What varieties are you testing?
So we've got TIF9 and TIF Quick, UF Riata, Pensacola and Argentine, even though we aren't recommending those anymore. They're the standards that we would compare against. And then the deal was so that Auburn would also have a location for me over there. We put in one of their old varieties called Sand Mountain. I was kind of hoping it would be a wild card and do really well down here, but it's not doing so well for us. It was bred for a more northern, non-Alapaha soil type region. It's hanging in there, but I think in 3 or 4 years, it's not going to be there anymore.
I have a question about the hay with the cattle problems. So this year we're experiencing quite a few cattle passing away or getting down and not getting up. That's why we're wanting to test our hay to see if it's maybe something that's coming from where we're buying our hay. We don't cut our hay on site. We just buy it from the locals down the road. What kind of experiences have you seen with cattle problems?
The list I had going from calls that I've had this past 2 weeks or so, nitrates have shown up a couple times. Not quite sure why, because we didn't really have a season last year that was necessarily conducive to nitrates, but they've been in a lot of the feed. Several with mold, even it's shown up more in baleage than hay, but there have been some toxic mold cases, especially in the peanut hay. And with all this mud that we've had, people when we're dropping hay on ground, we can start increasing the instance of the parasite load if we're not careful. Sadly, a lot of it goes back to we haven't accounted for how cold it's been. I don't know where you all are at. It's cold in Tifton these past couple weeks, and that's going to increase the nutrient demands of the animal. And then an animal walking through mud, and we have no shortage of mud in Georgia right now, further increases their nutrient demands. And so in a lot of cases, the producer is still dropping their set number of bales like they always do. And the nutrient demands have increased. And so the animals just aren't eating enough. And in some situations, you would just see it as, they start to lose condition. But when there's all these other issues that are possibly exacerbating the issue, then we get into a really bad domino effect situation that's causing us to lose a lot of animals. But you're on the right track with the forage test there, because every single call that's came in, question one has been, did you take a forage test? And if they can't email it to me, then they went to get one that day.
Well, we're seeing them in a lot of our calves. We've had two of the mama calves go down, and we couldn't get them back. But we've had 4 or 5 calves having this issue. 2 being right now. One, we got back up feeding them a bunch of like sweet feed and stuff like supplements, and the one I have right now is about 6 months old. That she's down, and we have been unable to get her up. But we just had to worm her because the vet did say that she had a lot of worms. But what do you suggest on like feeding them? Sticking the hay on the ground? We have hay rings, but should we be trying to feed them with the hay off the ground?
Yes, I mean, ideally we would have it in some sort of bunk, and that's just not feasible for most of us in many cases. It helps if we can move that hay ring around if we are unrolling different areas, so that way we're not creating a nutrient and parasite dense area. That's probably the easiest thing that we can do. Beyond that, that would have to be a conversation with one of our beef specialists.
If there aren't any other questions, I would like to thank Dr. Baxter again, and thank everybody for coming, and hope you all have a good evening.